On the 28th of December, 1836, a bricklayer named Bond found a bundle wedged behind a paving stone on the Edgware Road, wrapped in a coarse sack and tied with cord, the kind of parcel a passer-by might ordinarily step past without looked twice. Inside was the torso of a woman. No head, no legs, no hands to identify her by, no clothing left on the body to say who she had once been or who might be missing her. For 6 weeks, London would only have pieces of her. It would take a canal, a ditch, and 3 separate discoveries in 3 separate corners of the city before anyone could finally say her name out loud. Tonight we revisit a case that turned an entire city into an unwilling investigator. A murder solved not in a single dramatic breakthrough, but piece by piece, parcel by parcel across the width of London itself. One bride 2 days from her wedding, one intended husband with a fortune that existed only in his own telling of it, and one body that refused, however thoroughly it was scattered, to stay unidentified. The case of Hannah Brown begins in London in the autumn of 1836, at a moment when her life seemed, for the first time in years, to be turning toward something better. She was a widow, a working laundress in her middle years, established near the Middlesex Hospital in a modest but respectable lodging she had built for herself through years of steady, unglamorous labor. Laundry work in early Victorian London was exhausting, physical, poorly paid, and almost entirely invisible to the more comfortable classes whose linens it kept clean. The kind of trade a widow without other means fell into and rarely climbed out of. Hannah Brown had spent years inside that trade, and by the autumn of 1836 she had, by the standards of her situation, built herself a stable, independent life. She had no husband's income to rely on and no family fortune behind her. What she had was her own labor, her own lodging, and apparently a small accumulation of savings and possessions that represented the whole of what a life like hers could realistically set aside. Into that carefully built stability walked a man named James Greenacre, a grocer by trade, who had in fact failed at grocery and at nearly every other business venture he had ever attempted. His most recent scheme, run out of his house at Carpenter's Buildings in Camberwell, involved manufacturing what he called amalgamated candy, a patent remedy for throat and chest complaints supposedly derived from a rare herb he claimed to have discovered during his travels in America. It was, like nearly everything else about James Greenacre, a fabrication dressed up as expertise, sold to a public with no easy way of checking his claims against the truth. He met Hannah Brown around September of 1836, while still deep in the financial difficulties that candy could not solve, and he told her he owned farmland in America near Hudson Bay, a substantial and entirely fictional fortune waiting across the ocean for the right wife to share it with him. A cabinet maker named Evan Davis would later testify at trial that he had personally heard Greenacre describe an estate of roughly 1,000 acres, described with the easy, specific confidence of a man who had told the same lie enough times to polish it smooth. What the surviving record also makes clear, and what a simpler telling of this case too often leaves out, is that Hannah Brown was not simply an innocent led astray by a stranger's fiction. She, too, represented herself as considerably wealthier than she actually was, claiming to Greenacre that she possessed something in the region of £300 to £400, a genuinely substantial sum for a working laundress and roughly what several years of skilled labor might have earned her, though almost certainly more than she actually had in hand. Their courtship, in other words, was built on 2 exaggerated fortunes rather than one, each of them courting the other under a version of themselves neither could actually afford to be. Their courtship moved quickly. Marriage bans were read at their parish church in late November and early December of 1836, and a wedding date was fixed for Christmas Day. Believing she was about to become the wife of a man of American property, Hannah Brown began selling off her possessions, closing out the modest, hard-won independence she had spent years assembling, in order to step cleanly into the new life she believed was waiting for her. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. What exactly happened on the 24th of December 1836 is the one part of this case that the surviving record cannot deliver with total certainty, because the only witness who could describe it in full never gave an account anyone could fully trust. That afternoon, Hannah Brown left her lodgings near the Middlesex Hospital and travelled with James Greenacre by hansom cab toward his house at Carpenter's Buildings in Camberwell, on what should have been one of the last ordinary errands before her wedding. She did not survive the journey, or did not survive whatever happened once it ended. The prosecution would later argue that Greenacre had planned her murder from the start, luring a financially secure widow into marriage purely to seize what modest fortune she actually possessed once the fiction of his own wealth became impossible to sustain. Greenacre himself, once finally cornered, offered a different account, that the two of them had argued over money, that Christmas Eve, that Hannah had revealed she was not nearly as wealthy as she had allowed him to believe, and that in the heat of that argument he had struck her once with a piece of wood, an accident he insisted he had never intended. There is a bitter, almost mathematical irony sitting inside that mutual exaggeration, and it deserves to be named plainly. Two people who each needed the other to be wealthier than they were had spent weeks building a marriage on a foundation neither of them could actually afford, and when that foundation cracked, on the one afternoon it mattered most, it was Hannah Brown who paid for the collapse with her life, rather than Greenacre paying for it with his pride. Whatever precisely was said in that house on Christmas Eve, the argument the record points toward was not a stranger's malice, descending on an innocent woman out of nowhere. It was two invented fortunes finally colliding with the truth at the worst possible moment in the worst possible way. The medical evidence would eventually contradict him on the single most important detail of that claim. 3 surgeons who examined the recovered remains testified that the wounds to the victim's right eye and throat had been inflicted before death, not in one accidental blow, but through a sustained and deliberate assault. Whatever actually happened inside that house on Christmas Eve, it was not, by the account of the men whose professional task it was to read the body's own evidence, a single tragic accident. What happened after her death was not accidental in any sense at all. Hannah Brown's body was dismembered, methodically enough that a saw and a knife later recovered from Greenacre's residence were matched by the same surgeons to the specific pattern of the mutilation wounds, and the pieces were distributed deliberately to 3 separate and distant corners of London, an act of calculation entirely at odds with the story of a single moment's uncontrolled rage. Sit with the geography of what he did next, because it tells you more about the man than almost anything else in this record ever will. He did not simply hide a body in a cellar, a garden, a shallow grave behind the house. He divided a human being into pieces, wrapped each one separately, and carried those pieces individually across a city of well over 1 million people, trusting distance and anonymity to do what a single burial never could have managed. That is not the arithmetic of a man losing control in the heat of an argument. It is the arithmetic of a man calculating, piece by piece, exactly how far he needed to travel before each part of her stopped being traceable back to him. If the sheer calculation of that act unsettles you as much as it unsettled the surgeons who later testified to it, take a moment now to subscribe and tell me in the comments what you think it actually takes for a person to move from panic to that level of methodical planning inside the same handful of hours. Now, back to the record. The torso reached the Edgware Road first, on the 28th of December, found by the bricklayer Bond behind his paving stone, in the kind of quiet residential street where a carefully wedged parcel could sit for days without drawing a second glance. For more than a week, that was all London's investigators had: a headless, legless torso with no clothing and no obvious point of origin, in a city large enough to absorb a mystery like that without a ripple. Then on the 6th of January, 1837, canal workers going about entirely ordinary lock maintenance on the Regent's Canal in Stepney, more than 3 miles east of the Edgware Road, dredged up a woman's severed head, caught in the machinery of a lock gate they had opened for nothing more dramatic than routine repairs. Nearly a month after that, on the 2nd of February, a pair of legs was found in a ditch beside Cold Harbour Lane in Camberwell. Wrapped in a sack and left in undergrowth close enough to Greenacre's own neighbourhood that in hindsight it reads less like careful planning and more like a man running out of both nerve and imagination as the weeks wore on. There was a crude logic to the choice of locations, even if it was never a particularly safe one. The Edgware Road was miles from Camberwell, distant enough to put real geographic space between Greenacre's own home and the first and most identifiable piece of evidence. The canal offered moving water, and the assumption, not unreasonable for the era, that a lock's machinery might damage or disperse anything committed to it before it was ever found intact. The ditch beside Cold Harbour Lane offered nothing but proximity and convenience, the choice of a man whose planning had visibly deteriorated by the third and final piece he needed to dispose of. Read together. The 3 sites tell their own quiet story of diminishing composure, a killer growing less careful, not more, as the initial panic of Christmas Eve gave way to the exhausting logistics of making a human body disappear. It was a parish surgeon, working with nothing more sophisticated than direct physical comparison, who finally connected the pieces, judging that the proportions and the condition of the torso, the head, and the legs belonged to a single woman. Even by the primitive standards of 1830s forensic medicine, the match, once proposed, held. What the investigators still lacked was a name, a face, and any way of connecting 3 widely separated discoveries back to a single living person who had once walked London's streets rather than simply appearing in pieces along its canal banks and ditches. There was no telegraph line summoning detectives between one discovery site and the next, no central file where a torso found near Edgware Road in December could be automatically cross-referenced against a head recovered from a canal lock in Stepney 5 weeks later. Each discovery was, in effect, its own separate investigation, handled by whichever parish officers and surgeons happened to be nearest, with no guarantee that anyone would ever think to connect one grim find to another unless a sufficiently observant professional happened to notice the pattern for himself. Consider what that gap in the investigation actually meant for the case. For weeks, Hannah Brown existed in the official record only as an assembled set of remains, a torso here, a head there, a pair of legs somewhere else entirely, 3 discoveries that had to be physically reconstructed into a single identifiable woman before anyone could even begin asking who had done this to her, or why. The very method Greenacre had chosen to dispose of her, scattering her across the width of the city, was itself functioning as a second, ongoing assault on her identity, an erasure that continued for weeks after her actual death, until investigators and neighbors who had known her began, slowly, to piece the geography of the discoveries back together into a name. The broadside trade that fed on this case deserves its own honest reckoning, because the appetite it served is not nearly as distant from our own moment as the powdered wigs and gas lamps might suggest. Within days of each grim discovery, cheap printed sheets were circulating through London streets, hawked by vendors for a penny or two, promising the fullest and most horrifying account of the Edgware Road tragedy available anywhere. Woodcut illustrations imagined the crime scene in lurid, Invented detail no witness had actually provided. Confession pamphlets, some genuine and some entirely fabricated, sold briskly to a public that wanted the satisfaction of understanding a monstrous act without ever having to sit through the slower, more uncertain work of an actual investigation. It is worth remembering, watching this unfold from nearly 2 centuries later, that the hunger to consume a stranger's murder as entertainment did not begin with any modern technology at all. It began exactly here, with a penny broadside and a woodcut too grim to be entirely honest, and it has simply changed its medium every few decades since. That name, once it surfaced, led investigators quickly toward the man who had been courting her and toward the woman he was now living with instead. On the 25th of March, 1837, Inspector George Feltham went to a residence in St. Albans Place, Lambeth, and arrested James Greenacre, finding him there in the company of a woman named Sarah Gale, who was discovered in possession of several items that had once belonged to Hannah Brown, along with remnants of fabric that matched precisely the sacking Hannah's remains had been wrapped in. I want you to think carefully about Sarah Gale for a moment, because the record leaves her sitting in a genuinely uncomfortable middle ground that this account has no interest in flattening into something simpler than it actually was. She was not accused of the killing itself, and nothing in the surviving evidence places her inside the Red Barn or a hansom cab or wherever Hannah Brown actually died. She was accused, and ultimately convicted, of knowing what James Greenacre had done, sheltering him regardless of that knowledge, and quietly profiting from property that had belonged to a murdered woman, while that same woman's own family and friends were still out searching for her. That is a different order of wrongdoing entirely from the murder itself, and the law of 1837 was not always careful about drawing that line as clearly as it should have. If a case like this leaves you with more questions about complicity than it actually answers, about exactly how much a person has to know before their silence becomes its own kind of guilt, I would ask you to subscribe and share your own answer honestly in the comments below. Now back to the record. Both Greenacre and Gale stood trial together at the Old Bailey, the proceedings opening on the 3rd of April, 1837, before the Lord Chief Justice, Sir Nicholas Conyngham Tyndall, with the prosecution led by John Adolphus and William Henry Bodkin. The Metropolitan Police itself was barely 8 years old at the time of the murder, still a young and often distrusted institution in a city that had policed itself through parish constables and private watchmen for generations before it. And the investigators working the Greenacre case had none of the tools a modern detective would take for granted. No fingerprinting, no photography for identifying the dead, no forensic laboratory beyond a parish surgeon's trained eye, and a willingness to lay 3 sets of remains side by side and judge, by proportion and by instinct, whether they belonged to the same woman. The trial drew enormous crowds, the kind of public spectacle that the era's cheap broadside presses and penny portrait sellers were only too happy to supply, printing lurid woodcut illustrations of the crime scene and rushing confession pamphlets to press within days of the verdict, feeding a public appetite for every gruesome detail of the case that the courtroom's own restraint could never fully satisfy. The jury deliberated for only 15 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty against James Greenacre for the willful murder of Hannah Brown. Sarah Gale was convicted separately as an accessory for harboring Greenacre and knowingly retaining property that belonged to his victim. Greenacre was sentenced to hang. Gale was sentenced to transportation for life to the penal colony of New South Wales, and was ultimately removed from Newgate to a prison hulk before her eventual passage, accompanied, according to the surviving record, by her own young child. A jury needed only 15 minutes to decide Greenacre's fate, working from evidence that a modern courtroom would consider primitive at best. A surgeon's educated eye stood in for a forensic laboratory that would not exist for another century. A saw and a knife were matched to mutilation wounds by direct visual comparison rather than by any instrument capable of measuring the match with real precision. Ordinary witnesses who could place Greenacre with Hannah Brown on the day she vanished carried nearly as much weight in that courtroom as any physical exhibit the prosecution actually produced. If you think a conviction built that quickly on tools that thin still deserves the same lasting confidence the Georgian public gave it in 1837, I would genuinely like to know. Subscribe and tell me your answer in the comments, because it says as much about how we judge certainty today as it does about how that courtroom judged it then. Now, back to the record. It is worth pausing on what actually made a scheme like Greenacre's possible in the London of 1836. There was no central registry a working widow could consult to verify a suitor's claimed American property, no institution capable of confirming or denying 1,000 acres near Hudson Bay from a parlour in Camberwell. Confidence, a plausible manner, and a story told with enough specific, invented detail to sound rehearsed rather than improvised, were often the only currency a fraud of Greenacre's kind ever needed to spend. His amalgamated candy business had already tested exactly that same confidence on a smaller scale, selling a fictional cure to a public with no way of checking his claims against any real herbal expertise. And it had failed only because the product itself was too modest, too easily disappointing to sustain the lie for long. Marriage promised something candy never could, an entire fortune's worth of trust, extended all at once, on the strength of nothing more than a story well told. There is a particular kind of cruelty embedded in that last detail that deserves to be named plainly. Whatever Sarah Gale actually knew, and whatever she actually did to earn her conviction, the sentence handed down did not touch her alone. It carried a child across the world in the company of a mother now permanently marked as a convicted accessory to one of the most notorious murders of the decade. A consequence the law of the day did not trouble itself to weigh against the severity of what she had actually been proven to do. Laundry work of the kind Hannah Brown performed for years was among the most physically punishing trades available to a working widow in early Victorian London. It meant hours bent over washtubs of scalding, lye-heavy water, hauling wet linen in loads that could weigh more than the woman carrying them, working through winter cold and summer heat alike because wealthier households needed clean linen every week regardless of the season. It was a trade that broke bodies steadily and rewarded them poorly, and a woman who managed to build any kind of independent stability out of it, as Hannah Brown evidently had earned that stability through a decade or more of exactly the kind of unglamorous physical endurance that Victorian society rarely troubled itself to notice, let alone celebrate. Before we go further, I want you to sit for a moment with who Hannah Brown was, because it is far too easy, in a case built on wounds and sawn limbs and canal discoveries, to let the crime crowd out the person. She was not a foolish woman. She had spent years supporting herself through hard physical labor in a trade that offered no shortcuts and no safety net, and she had done it successfully enough to accumulate the small, hard-won stability that made her in the end worth targeting at all. Her mistake, if it can even be called that, was extending ordinary trust to a man who had built an entire fictional identity specifically to exploit exactly that kind of trust. She deserved a wedding on Christmas Day. She deserved, at the very least, to be buried once, in one place under her own name, rather than reassembled from 3 separate discoveries across 6 freezing weeks before anyone could even begin to mourn her properly. James Greenacre was executed outside Newgate Prison on the 2nd of May, 1837, before a crowd drawn by weeks of newspaper coverage and broadside sensationalism. His body afterward interred within the prison's own precincts, denied even the dignity of a marked grave beyond its walls. He was hanged less than 7 weeks before an 18-year-old princess named Victoria ascended to the throne of a kingdom that would spend the following 6.5 decades defining, for better and for worse, exactly the moral and social world this case had just exposed the ugliest edges of fortune, respectability, and the enormous gap between what a person claimed to be and what a parish surgeon's careful reassembly of a body could eventually prove they actually were. In the days between his sentencing and his execution, he asked repeatedly for pen, ink, and paper, producing revised statements and confessions that continued shifting in their details right up until the morning he was hanged, never settling, even at the very end, on a single, fully consistent account of exactly what had happened to Hannah Brown on Christmas Eve. That refusal to settle is, in its own way, the most honest thing Greenacre ever offered this case. A man capable of inventing an entire fictional fortune to win a widow's trust was never, in the end, a reliable narrator of his own crime, and the surviving record is left holding several different Greenacres. The calculating fortune hunter the prosecution described, the panicked man defending a single accidental blow, and the condemned prisoner still revising his story with pen and paper on the very eve of his death. Which of those men actually stood in that Camberwell house on Christmas Eve, 1836, is a question the historical record was never given a fully trustworthy witness to answer, because the one man who could answer it spent his final weeks proving, over and over, exactly how little his own account could be trusted. I keep coming back to Sarah Gale's child, standing somewhere on that transport ship's deck beside a mother, now permanently marked as a convicted accessory, because it is the one detail this case never resolves and never even really attempts to. We know Greenacre's story in exhaustive detail, however many shifting versions of it he eventually gave us in his final weeks. We know Hannah Brown's final months, her savings, her wedding bands, the small invented fortune she believed would finally make her respectable. What we do not know is what became of a woman sent to the far side of the world for the crime of loving, or at least sheltering, the wrong man, or what became of the child who made that entire voyage beside her, carrying a mother's conviction into a childhood neither of them had ever chosen for themselves. If a detail like that stays with you the way it stays with me, subscribe, and tell me in the comments whether you think Georgian justice ever really distinguished between guilt and mere proximity to it. Now, back to the record. The Edgware Road itself has been rebuilt many times over since 1836, its Georgian terraces gradually replaced by the ordinary churn of a modern London thoroughfare, and no marker anywhere along its length recalls the paving stone where a bricklayer named Bond once found the first of 3 parcels that would take a city 6 weeks to read as a single woman's name. The Regent's Canal still runs through Stepney, carrying pleasure boats now rather than the grim cargo a lock once yielded up in January of 1837. Cold Harbour Lane has long since been swallowed into the ordinary fabric of Camberwell. What remains more than the physical geography is the shape of the case itself, a murder that could only be solved by literally reassembling its own victim from pieces scattered across a city that never intended to become anyone's investigator, and a killer whose own final words never quite agreed on what, exactly, he had done to make that reassembly necessary in the first place. Hannah Brown's grave, wherever it ultimately lay, has not survived in any form the modern visitor could find and stand before. What survives instead is the paper trail, the trial transcripts, the surgeon's testimony, the broadsides that once sold her death by the penny on street corners. She had walked in life without anyone troubling to remember her name until it was too late to matter. It is, in the end, the only kind of memorial a working laundress with no family fortune and no surviving portrait was ever likely to receive from an era that valued her labor and overlooked her entirely, right up until 3 separate parts of her body forced an entire city to finally take notice.